Welcome to the endpoint hardening techniques lesson. Started. Objectives. List ways to hide methods used to secure endpoint access. Increased expertise in client and server toward companies and home environments. Endpoints is that a network that can be devices. Broken down into cells to enforce using the principle of learning the local entity, boot management, local techniques. Are patched and updated regularly. Backups for easy devices, which can be done locally available, or network intrusion detection, implement endpoint detection and respond to undiscovered attacks, and take immediate action against the first three topics. Endpoints and IoT devices. This is especially important in a password that the user is not required to change on installation. Tracking down and enforcing secure passwords on all connected devices is a simple first step that can help reduce your overall risk. A common first attack strategy is to scan a network for devices and attempt to log in and gain access to a local device using default passwords. Another important step in securing endpoints is to ensure that users, especially administrators, have access to only the permissions they need to perform their duties. Many endpoints, even basic IoT devices, grant users the ability to create administrative roles and permissions sets. This allows the creation of authenticated roles that allow users and administrators access to only the features they need on a device. This prevents a weak password or social engineering attack from granting an attacker access to more permissions by accident. If an attacker gains access to an account with restricted access, it will be much less damaging than if an attacker gains full administrative access because the device is using the default administrative role. The enforcement of permissions based on need is called the principle of least privilege, or POLP, and is a good rule to follow when defining any security policy, whether for endpoints, authentication, or file access. For similar endpoints that can't restrict user or administrative access, consider locking down access with very secure passwords or two-factor authentication, or restricting which IP addresses can access the device using another device, such as a router or firewall. Thorough defense is very important when hardening endpoints. If there are multiple layers of security, it is more difficult to compromise an endpoint and use it to further attack a network. Remember, a network is only as secure as its most vulnerable endpoint, so having a broader top-down view when designing and enforcing security can be a great help in determining policies for a network, even if they cannot be applied equally to all devices. A frequently overlooked area in endpoint security is the hardening of endpoint firmware and boot processes. Most security practices focus on securing devices when they are running and connected to the network. However, threats that attack the firmware and boot processes of endpoint devices have been emerging. Hardening firmware and boot processes is especially important for IoT devices, which lack many of the built-in protections that more traditional desktops, laptops, and servers have integrated over the years to protect against malicious firmware compromise. Physically securing devices so that attackers do not have physical access is extremely important. It is much easier to compromise a traditional computer system if you have physical access because many devices have an administrator account reset procedure that requires only physical access to the device. Locking down the basic input-output system BIOS and other boot time systems can prevent these types of attacks from being successful. Firmware is the software that usually runs from a chip on the endpoint. This software is responsible for detecting and reporting hardware connected to the device. After the firmware performs all the hardware checks, it assists in loading the operating system. Modern computers usually use either the legacy basic input-output system, BIOS, or the newer Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, UEFI. Both perform similar functions, but UEFI is much newer and usually incorporates a graphical interface and more robust security features. Understanding how your network endpoints load their operating systems and how to secure any potential compromise is important for preventing firmware malware attacks, where code is inserted into the firmware that can cause endpoints to load malicious software or whole new operating systems that can then be used to compromise other devices. Restricting firmware so that it loads only approved software is one of the most important new features of UEFI over BIOS. Choosing an OS is not a luxury security administrators usually have, but if possible, it is always a good idea to select and use an OS that is easy to manage and secure. Many OSs now have built-in security features that make it easier to manage and enforce security policies. In addition, many network security devices can now allow access based on OS type. Having a fixed list of trusted OSs can help you enforce overall network security by allowing only known OS types and versions to access your networks. That way, if a firmware attack compromises a device, which then attempts to connect to the network with an unknown OS, other security devices can deny the access. While BIOS and UEFI are specific to traditional computers and laptops, most endpoints use some sort of bootloader and firmware to secure and load the OS. Understanding and ensuring these systems are locked down is a fundamental step in endpoint security. One of the major advantages of using laptops and cell phones for work is that they are portable. One frequent concern about these devices is data security. If a laptop is stolen and the data is not encrypted, it is very easy for the thief to extract useful information. In addition to being harmful to the individual, an unencrypted corporate laptop can contain a wealth of viewing browser history and cached DNS queries on a computer, can reveal sensitive network information and security procedures. Fully securing and encrypting endpoints is a critical aspect of cybersecurity, especially for high-risk devices that may contain a great deal of sensitive information. The most common way to secure these devices is to use full disk encryption, or FDE. FDE is a software-based solution where the disk is encrypted by the OS. On boot time, the UEFI loads the decrypting information from the OS. The cryptographic keys are usually stored in a trusted platform module, TPM, and protected by a password or other authentication method. After the keys are accessed, the disk can be decrypted, and the OS can be loaded normally. Because the entire disk is encrypted, if it is stolen, no useful information drive encryption, which is very costly. Another way to implement full disk encryption is to use a self-encrypting drive, or SED. An SED is a hard drive with a built-in module that automatically handles the encryption and decryption of the contents of the hard drive using instructions from the firmware and OS. Using an SED pushes the cryptographic effort onto the built-in module in the hard drive, rather than the device CPU and software. A final way to protect data on an endpoint is to use DLP software. This can detect if someone is trying to copy sensitive information from a device or send it over the network. DLP can block or log the transaction for security. Another common use of DLP is to prevent or limit the use of attachable drives, like USB flash drives or external hard drives, to prevent the copying of large amounts of data. DLP can also be network-based, where devices inspect network traffic to alert administrators to keywords or other sensitive information being transmitted over networks. Many modern devices like smartphones automatically use full disk encryption, but on some devices, this may be an option that is disabled by default. Always check if disk encryption and IoT devices that may not have these features enabled by default. In any environment, it is extremely important for administrators to be able to update, patch, and backup reliable patching and backup schedules is usually related to the sheer number of different devices and procedures required to perform updates and backups. Having a standardized desktop, laptop, server, and smartphone model and manufacturer for a company can greatly simplify the task of patch and update maintenance. However, this is not always viable because of the need to support critical legacy equipment and the rise of bring your own device, or BYOD, in work environments. Keeping patches up to date is critical because identifying and closing potential vulnerabilities is a key step in preventing a large-scale cybersecurity attack. Updating OSs, firmware, and vulnerable software programs and applications is a simple and effective way to reduce overall risk. While necessarily effective in preventing zero-day attacks, having a fully patched and updated system can also help slow down and restrict the compromising of systems using common, well-established malware and attack vectors. If your endpoint and network infrastructure is up to date and healthy, a new unknown attack method may be able to compromise a system, but further infiltration may be hindered because no other tools in an attacker's toolkit will be effective in pivoting to other systems or collecting and exfiltrating data. In addition to maintaining, patching, and updating software, having a comprehensive backup solution for critical endpoints can greatly assist in recovering from cyber attacks or accidents. You should back up critical endpoint devices like smartphones, laptops, servers, and databases frequently. If a device is compromised, you can then collect forensic information and easily restore the device to the latest clean copy with as little disruption as possible. Backing up IoT devices like security cameras or smart locks depends heavily on the manufacturer, and many such devices do not have backup capability. In this case, having backup equipment that you can configure easily to replace damaged, stolen, or compromised devices should be part of a comprehensive disaster recovery plan. Having a regular backup schedule for all your devices, from computers to cameras, is one of the most effective ways to mitigate a ransomware attack. If you have a current backup of your critical data, it is much easier to restore and recover endpoints affected by ransomware. You have completed the lesson. You are now able to list ways to harden an endpoint using common administrative controls, describe methods used to secure endpoint software and firmware, explain why managing endpoints is critical for maintaining overall cybersecurity, describe how to harden an endpoint without administrative access,